Okay, so welcome back for the afternoon session. The first thing on this afternoon is the keynote by Jamie Collier from Mandiant. Jamie is remote. Can you hear us, Jamie?
Hi, everyone.
Okay, wonderful. The speaker is going to be introduced by Professor Cyril Arto. He's also going to handle the Q&A afterwards. Cyril, please.
Thank you, Rolf. This morning we learned a lot about technology, but geopolitics is equally important in cybersecurity. And in this slide, it's my pleasure to introduce Jamie Collier. He got his PhD in cybersecurity at Oxford University and then worked for a while as a cyber threat intelligence team lead at Digital Shadows. He's now senior advisor at Mandiant, which is also part of Google Cloud, and he works with organizations to understand the threat landscape and build threat intelligence capabilities. He is also an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, which is a think tank in defense and security. So I'm very much looking forward to this keynote to get more of a broad overview about the situation in general in cybersecurity. So Jamie, the word is yours.
Thanks, Cyril, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry to not be there in person. Unfortunately, I had another commitment when I was invited that I'd already agreed to this morning, but really thrilled to be given the opportunity to speak. So what I want to do today is cover some of the threats that we're seeing in the landscape right now and cover a few different topics. I think mostly, given the theme of the conference, be focusing on state cyber threats and those that are government-backed, but we'll also talk a little bit about non-state actors, in particular, both hacktivists and ransomware groups, as well as their connections to the state. But before I begin talking about the threats that we're seeing at Mandiant, I think it's just worth backing up for a minute and exploring, well, why do we talk about the threats in the first place? And really what we're talking about here is not identifying and talking about threats for the sake of it, but we see that at Mandiant there being a very clear opportunity to take all of those relevant threats, perhaps those are threats that might be targeting Sweden or might be targeting the government, and convert that into something that is really actionable. And that's what we mean when we talk about intelligence. It's taking action on the back of identifying relevant threats. That could be at a very strategic level, deciding big investment pieces or cyber policy related to threats, or it could be something very operational around detecting threats that we're really focused on. And if we can do that, we're in a really exciting place where we can not only improve security outcomes, but at a policy level, design much smarter policy that is factored in these threats and knowledge of these threats into our security strategy. So with that, I want to begin this talk by just reflecting on what we've learned when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And I think now we've got the benefit of a little bit of time and we can start to understand the different trends, the different developments, the strategic takeaways from the conflict. So if I just provide a high-level overview to kick things off, I think it's fair to say, Mandy, we've got a good amount of experience here. We do over 1,000 incident response engagements per year, and we've been very active in Ukraine as well during that time. So I think when we first the activity we first saw, that kind of phase one, well that was actually before the war. So that was kind of long-term, it's persistent cyber espionage, pre-positioning, if you like, and that was probably intended to address Russian intelligence requirements and their collection requirements before any attempted occupation. Now, as the invasion began, that's where we saw phase two, and that covered the widespread intrusions into a range of different key government ministries and critical infrastructure, and really across Ukraine. And that also included destructive activity observed at Ukrainian ministries contributing to the war effort. Moving forward, we saw phase three occur. That was really kind of between May to July 2022, if you like. That was consisted of sustained targeting that took place from that period and included a second wave of disruptive attacks. Then we saw phase four, that ran from August to September, featured new espionage targeting from a variety of Russian actors during that time. And I think more recently, it's that renewed campaign of destructive attacks as well. But I think what is interesting in the main is that Russian operations have been highly focused on Ukraine itself, and seeing some impact beyond Ukraine, especially in that part of the world and in kind of neighboring countries. But to a large extent, it has been focused on Ukraine at a high level. But it is also interesting to observe, for instance, that we've also seen heightened threats to NATO countries. So we saw, for instance, to give you a data point, Russia government-backed groups increase their targeting of users in NATO countries by 300% in 2022 compared to 2020. So there's really different threats. When we talk about Russia, Ukraine, we talk about the cyber threats coming out of Russia. It's not the case that there's only one Russian threat, or the Russian government is a coherent entity. What we actually see is, as you might expect, that there are different Russian government agencies and intelligence organizations, whether that is the GRU, the Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, or the FSB, and they have different mandates. And their cyber operations, and the way that they're targeting, and whether they're focused on Ukraine or further abroad, those cyber operations reflect these broader mandates that these intelligence and military intelligence agencies have. So with that, I think it's perhaps interesting to explore not just what we've seen in Ukraine, but what we've seen further afield as well. And I think when we're talking about those threat actors that are more expansive, I think APT29 jumps out to me. This is a threat group that we track at Mandiant that is associated with Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. And as I mentioned, this is much more active really across Europe, whereas other groups have been tightly focused on Ukraine. You might be familiar with the 2020 SolarWinds supply chain compromise, right? And this is, of course, an incident that Mandiant is intimately familiar with. I think what is interesting is that while APT29 is now well associated with that SolarWinds compromise, it's probably missed that actually that there was a much broader context there around APT29 and supply chain more broadly. So we see, for instance, that APT29 has previously targeted organizations via their trusted partners, via cloud providers, by managed service providers, all of these different areas. So APT29 highly persistent. If it wants to target an organization, it might do that indirectly by going through some of these partner organizations. We saw, for instance, as well, that APT29 has a strong interest in the cloud, previously gone after Microsoft 365 environments, tried to disable logging to make it much harder to detect their activity, and critically also respond to it as well. And then we also see that, as with many of these sophisticated groups, they have immense operational capability, that APT29 is able to conduct multiple large-scale operations across different time zones simultaneously. So this is the sort of group we're talking about, and as I mentioned, highly active across Europe and especially in the government sector, likely to support Russian intelligence collection efforts in response to understanding how Western governments are approaching the conflict. Now, I think one other really interesting component of the threat landscape, and I should stress that this in control of malware we've not actually formally attributed to Russia, but it does look like there is some overlap there, and it's certainly aligned with Russian interests. But we've seen quite a few very interesting attacks and malware variants that are going after what we call operational technology. So what I mean by operational technology are the systems and processes interacting with physical processes. So we can think of, say, energy would be the obvious one, systems interacting with energy, but we could also think of, in other cases we've seen, say, water treatment facilities, these sorts of things that are really tied to critical infrastructure. We've seen some really interesting malware in this space over the last few months, if not year. You can see, for instance, we're in control of some of the potential scenarios there, including shutting down operations of industrial control systems, sabotaging industrial processes, even potentially causing physical destruction. And we've seen many other malware variants that have done similar things, whether that is, you might be familiar with another one called Indestroyer 2. We've also seen Ukrainian critical infrastructure organizations targeted in kind of multi-level event cyber attack that leveraged different techniques for disrupting operational technology before deploying wiper malware to render those systems unusable. So I think this is one of the more interesting components of the conflict. But I think because the defense community has been pretty successful in detecting these, it's maybe not had quite the impact that we'd expected, but I think it's still significant nonetheless. I talked about, I mentioned at the start of this talk that I wanted to also cover non-state actors, and I think we've also seen that hacktivists have become extremely active during the conflict, both on the pro-Ukraine and the pro-Russian side. And to a large extent, I think it's fair to say that these hacktivist groups, these ideologically motivated cyber groups, are at least some of them are certainly independent, that they are perhaps acting in support of the Russian government or because they are patriotic, for instance, but they're not necessarily being directed by the Russian government. But there is also evidence and some really interesting case studies where it would appear that there is coordination between some of these hacktivist groups and the GRU or threat actors that are associated to the GRU, such as APT28. For those not familiar, the GRU is Russia's military intelligence agency. So what we have seen, for example, is victims being targeted by APT28 and APT28 potentially disrupting their systems, or also perhaps stealing data. And within 24 hours, that data is then being leaked and posted online or via some of these hacktivist Telegram channels. So that would suggest that there is at least some level of coordination between these hacktivist groups and APT28. Now, it's not clear exactly if this is just one and the same, so these hacktivist groups are actually fronts for APT28, or if there's actually coordination between different entities and APT28 is passing that on. But that is actually just one of many different ways in which we see that the lines between states and non-states and different boundaries blurring. And I think in the West, we like to have these very clear distinctions. We like to look at cybercrime, and we like to look at espionage, and we like to look at hacktivism or ideologically motivated cyber attacks. What we see here is adversaries don't care about those distinctions. If we look at, for instance, the cyber criminal ecosystem, we've seen ransomware groups come out in support of the Russia and deploying kind of ransomware in a way to try and further Russia's national interests as well. And then I think the other really interesting thing that, at least from my side in the conflict, is the way that different types of operations are emerging. So we know, for instance, that Russia will conduct disruptive or destructive operations, such as deploying wiper malware or denial of service attacks. We also know that they are active in conducting information operations, trying to stir the pot or sow disinformation, sow discord in society. And what has been really interesting from my side is the way that these operations have been combined. So we've seen, for instance, Russian groups deploy wiper malware, while at the same time also conducting information operations. And I think that is a really interesting challenge for organizations, because it effectively means that they are often having to deal with different kind of cyber attacks, often simultaneously, right? So they might actually be having, on the one hand, dealing with wiper malware, and on the other hand, there is this information operation going on. And I think it's also, from a policy perspective, it's important that we appreciate these attacks for what they are. So if I give you one example, we saw the Ukrainian financial services sector being targeted by a DDoS attack, but that was combined with text messages being sent to Ukrainian individuals telling them that their bank was offline. So while the denial of service attack, taking these systems offline, isn't actually particularly sophisticated, it's not something the technical security community would be too worried about, as the effects are very temporary. What we actually see is the main impact of that attack is not to create technical disruption. It is psychological in nature. It is trying to make Ukrainians doubt the integrity of their financial services system. It's making Ukrainians realize that their bank is offline and hoping that they will panic. And that is really interesting, because it shows for me that a big part of these operations is psychological in nature. We need to really think as a society how we confront those issues in addition to the technical challenges that these operations pose. So a lot there, I think. And to perhaps give you one example of these blurry distinctions as well, is that we've seen Russia also working further afield. So you might have seen this come out in the press a few weeks ago, but we analysed several documents belonging to a Russian IT contractor named NTC Vulcan, and the documents detail project requirements contracted with the Russian Ministry of Defence, and in at least one instance, a GRU unit. And these projects include tools, training platforms, a red team platform for exercising various types of offensive cyber operations. And for me, that is really interesting. And we also see, for instance, that many of these tools will blend different capabilities, that they will be conducting cyber espionage, they will be targeting operational technology, but also thinking about information operations. So Russia has this doctrine of information confrontation and psychological effect operations that doesn't have these clear distinctions between espionage, information operations, etc. And it's something that in the West, we maybe have a slightly more rigid framework that doesn't really comprehend and account for the way that Russia sees these issues. So challenges there of doctrine and adaptability in the West, I think. Now, I've talked a lot about Russia. I think it is also worth reflecting on the fact that it is not just Russia that is active in this conflict. So if we look within the region, for instance, at Mandiant, we have uncovered a different threat group. We call this UNC 1151, and the UNC effectively stands for a group that is where we haven't got quite as much data. It's uncategorized because we don't have as in-depth an understanding. But what's interesting about this group is we've tied this group to Belarus, or at least its operations reflect the interests of the Belarusian government, and targets include, say, Belarusian dissidents, media entities, and journalists. So it just reflects for me that actually, as we talk about the cyber threat landscape, we often talk about the big four. And by that, I mean Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. I think at a strategic level, what's going to be interesting is the way that maybe other states come to the fore in the next few years. And I think UNC 1151 is one example of that, and the way that Belarus is now active in this space. And for me, it's interesting to perhaps ponder where we might be in 5 years' time, and maybe we'll have a lot more kind of emerging states developing cyber capabilities. Now, I want to just shift gears at this point, and obviously talked about the threats posed from Russia, and I think that's a really important topic. But I think it's also perhaps interesting to explore some of the challenges in defending other sectors, and in particular, academia. And I think I've worked in academia myself, something I'm actively involved in academia, and I think there are some really acute challenges here, because on the one hand, there is quite a diverse threat landscape. We've talked about Russia, and I'm going to talk about some other states in a minute. But there is that quite diverse threat landscape, because you might have some states that are interested in targeting universities because of their intellectual property that they hold. And that might be a real concern, especially for organizations or universities that are maybe researching emerging technology, the likes of AI or 5G perhaps. But then you also have universities, often places where you might have those working that are maybe criticizing government regimes, or those that are conducting research that is unflattering to a government, should we say. And then you also have universities as a place where there's a lot of collaboration, and there might be conversations between academics and, say, government members. So often, actually, when threat groups target universities, they're not actually targeting the university itself. They're after the contacts and the partners of universities. So that is the first challenge, that diverse threat landscape. But then I think there are two others. I think first of all, we have these very disparate networks. There's a lot of kind of bring your own device. There is a lot of systems, if you like, that are outside the control of a university IT system. There will be official clouds and official SharePoints, if you like, but there will also be a lot of shadow IT, as people share documents maybe through personal addresses. So the boundaries between what's kind of in the university network and what is outside, that shadow OT, that's a real problem and a real concern. And then we have this very open culture. And I was like this. I was wanting to be collaborative. I wanted to share data, explore these issues with other academic partners. And that can also be a challenge in a world where cybersecurity wants to introduce access controls and restrict access, etc. So with that, what are the threats that we see that are targeting academia? And I'll think a bit more broadly about this. It won't be just on the threats they pose to academia, but I think I think one state that's clearly very active is China, and as you'll see on this slide, I think the reason that China is a serious concern, or Chinese government related hackers, I should say, is the sheer range of different kind of drivers that are influencing their cyber activity. So that might be market dominance and the desire to make sure that the Chinese economy and Chinese firms are highly competitive. But it could also be many of those regional issues, whether that is, say, Taiwan, whether that is the high level of activity within the Asia Pacific. And then, of course, China is also very interested in Russia-Ukraine, as any government might be. This is a large-scale global incident with clear geopolitical consequences, and China will want to understand how governments are reacting to this and what that might mean in their context. So lots of different drivers, and this can mean that these threat groups are targeting organizations for different reasons, or different reasons might make an organization an attractive target. And it could be that certain universities or certain entities are more attractive from a market dominance perspective, whereas other organizations may have more of a presence in Asia Pacific, and they might be targeted for those kind of geopolitical and security reasons, if you like. But I think there are some kind of interesting case studies we've got. If you look at, say, APT40, this is a Chinese espionage group that we've tracked for a while, and really APT40 active across quite a range of different sectors and industries. But I wanted to highlight this July 2021 US indictment. And if any of you are researching cyber operations in universities and you want to get really interesting data on cyber operations, the US indictments often actually have really high quality insight on how these operations and groups work. But I think it's interesting to see in this indictment, for instance, that APT40, as I said, were indicted related to compromising computer systems at a range of different companies, government entities, but also universities. So I think it does highlight that there are some quite real and acute threats from some pretty sophisticated groups. And data stolen included trade secrets, included intellectual property. We've also seen in the past that APT40 has historically had a strong interest in the maritime sector. Now, I think we talk a lot about Russian information operations, right? We talk about how Russia is interfering with electoral processes and democracy. And that's fine, and that's important to focus on. But I think it's also worth emphasizing that there is actually other states that are conducting information operations, and China is certainly one of those groups. And what we've seen in the past is that has expanded rapidly. In a few years ago, Chinese information operations very focused on the likes of Taiwan, Xinjiang, Hong Kong. We've seen that expand into other languages. We've seen it go more global, a lot of activity in the United States. But still, for a long time, it was focusing on those kind of political issues, if you like. But I talked about that market dominance, and I think there is a very interesting development more recently. If we look at the rare earths industry, this is a sector of real strategic importance for China. It's a very kind of strategically significant place in kind of Chinese power and Chinese negotiations. It's linked to a lot of important technology. And what we've actually seen is that the Chinese associated information operations are actually targeting Western rare earth companies. So for me, that is really interesting because it's one of the first cases where we've maybe seen private sector organizations targeted as part of these information operations. And then I think the other interesting component for me on Chinese information operations is the discussion on Taiwan, because you might have seen a few weeks ago, the director of CISA, Jen Easterly, came out and said that in the event of an invasion, there would actually be likely be a very significant cyber component beyond just Taiwan. So while we've seen, say, Russia very focused on Ukraine, I think what we would see China, at least based on this warning, is that the impact could be felt further afield. So quite a lot going on there. Also wanted to briefly touch on Iran, and this is probably less of a concern within Sweden and the Nordics, because the operations that we've seen coming out of Iran have been predominantly focused within the Middle East, and if not, then the United States. But we do see operations conducted by different intelligence and military agencies there. And there's some really interesting developments here, right? So we've seen, for instance, that we've seen a host of destructive operations targeting Albania. That was largely due to Albania hosting opposition or Iranian opposition members. And we saw some quite kind of destructive cyber operations conducted against Albania in response to that. So for me, that is significant that Iran is conducting these quite destructive cyber operations against a NATO member state. Well, for us at Mandiant, we think that that likely indicates an increased tolerance of risk when employing these disruptive tools against countries that are perceived to be working against Iranian interests. So Iran certainly very aggressive in the way that it conducts its cyber operations. We talked about how Russia is working with these contractors, with these other parts of the cyber criminal ecosystem. And that is perhaps a reoccurring theme, to the extent that when we perhaps reflect on Iran, what we find is that it's often working with, say, front companies, private contractors, technical universities, all to fulfill these operational mandates and initiatives. So quite a kind of wide spectrum as well. I want to reflect on one of our recently named groups, APT42. Now, this is an Iranian state-sponsored cyber espionage group, and it's tasked with conducting information collection and surveillance operations. And when we talk about most government espionage groups, they're typically targeting other governments. They're kind of conducting traditional intelligence collection against foreign ministries, for instance. That's not necessarily what we're seeing as much of with APT42. So what we actually see a lot of with APT42 targeting, and this includes the targeting of think tanks and academia, is, and this is also part of a broader theme when it comes to Iran, is that a lot of Iran's attention and focus when it comes to cyber operations is going after dissidents. It's going after individuals and organizations that are critical of the Iranian regime, or perhaps those that are conducting research that would be unflattering to the Iranian government. So academia, think tanks, they become a clear target when it comes to a state that is very motivated to go after dissidents and is using cyber operations for that purpose. And I think there are interesting kind of implications there if we reflect on the way that different states use cyber operations very different ways, whether that is more destructive operations or, in this case, to go after dissidents. But if we talk about these APT groups that we name, when we graduate a group to an APT, we're saying that this is one of the more sophisticated groups. An APT actually stands for Advanced Persistent Threat. So that is a naming convention that we use. And I think to a large extent, the community focuses on how these groups are advanced or technically sophisticated. So maybe they've used custom malware. Maybe they've conducted a supply chain compromise like APT29 with SolarWinds. But we don't talk as much about how these groups are persistent, how they're highly patient, how if they fail to compromise you the first time round, they'll try again and they'll try again. And for me, APT42 is interesting not because of their technical sophistication, but because of their persistence. So we've seen, for instance, that they've spent a very long time and they've invested a lot of time and effort into building rapport with their victims before sending them anything malicious. So, for instance, we've seen APT42 operatives build a conversation and sustain a dialogue with a target for up to 38 days before sending them any malicious links. So you can imagine if you've been in contact with an individual, you've been emailing someone for 38 days back and forth, perhaps about some research or something that you might be interested in, you can imagine that then this group is then building a very trusted environment and is much more likely to succeed in getting its targets to open perhaps a kind of malicious link or open a malicious attachment, for instance. Another group that we've seen targets a range of different entities, but also includes universities, is APT43. And this is a group that is linked to the North Korean government. And I think APT43 for me paint a really interesting picture, or they tell a really interesting story, because they have traditionally been very focused on what we might call traditional intelligence targets, going after South Korea, maybe United States, thinking, say, about missile development, these kind of very traditional intelligence targets, if you like. And universities probably targeted in relation to that, if not because of dissidents and those that are criticizing the regime, the North Korean regime, that are based in universities. But what we've seen with North Korea is, I think, something really interesting, because what we see coming out of their cyber operations is, on the one hand, they are conducting these strategic intelligence collection operations, very much like the ones that we'd see coming out of the likes of APT29. You're going after foreign ministries, defense contractors, things that military or intelligence agency would be really interested in. But we've also seen North Korean operations conduct financially motivated operations. So North Korea is unique in the way that it is using cyber operations to generate government revenue, and that's largely due to the tough economic climate for North Korea. But what's really interesting about APT43, while it has traditionally been a strategic intelligence collection group, it is now being tasked with also conducting financially motivated operations. And I think that is largely because it's not necessarily being asked to generate government revenue in the way that some other groups operating for North Korea might, but I think it's effectively now having to sustain its own operations. So it's this kind of pay your own way, if you like, that the North Korean government's probably saying to APT43, we want you to continue collecting this really strategically important information for us, but we don't want to have to fund you. We want you to be able to generate your own funds by conducting these financially motivated operations, such as ransomware or going after cryptocurrency. Now, I'm a big Christopher Nolan fan. I'm very excited about Oppenheimer, that's going to be coming out very soon. But some of you might have seen Inception. And Inception's one of these crazy films that I felt I had to watch it at least twice before I could really understand it. But the whole concept of Inception is that there is this team that go around planting ideas in people's heads by getting into their dreams and kind of manufacturing these dreams to give them ideas. And the whole kind of premise of the story is that they have to go a step further, and they have to kind of place a dream in a dream. And the reason I wanted to mention that is because it has some quite kind of fun overlap with a recent North Korean operation that we saw, where effectively what North Korea did was they conducted a supply chain attack in a supply chain attack. So this was really crazy. What we saw was a North Korean group. They got access to this first company. And what they did is they thought, wow, this is a company we've got access to that's working with a lot of other organizations. So we'll conduct a supply chain attack. So what that means is that they push malware in a legitimate update. So when you see on your phone that it needs to update, and you accept that update, what this group had done is they'd compromised that organization. And meant that as that update was being pushed and installed onto your device, it came with this malware. So that is what we see from time to time. It's normally a more sophisticated attack vector, but it is what we call a supply chain compromise. Interestingly, what we saw is that this group, as part of that supply chain compromise, found another organization that was working with a lot of clients to conducting an additional supply chain compromise. So really kind of bizarre, but I just thought it quite a fun case to highlight, as it just shows to you the scale of this sort of operation and the way that there can be these kind of cascading supply chains. So one of the more interesting operations we've seen recently. Now, I want to shift gears very quickly and just talk for the last 5 minutes or so on some interesting developments we've seen when it comes to ransomware. So I think the first thing to say of ransomware is that it is increasingly what we find is that ransomware isn't conducted by just one group. You might actually have one group that gains access to an organization's environment. They might then pass that access on or sell that access on to a different group that uses that access to move around in an organization's environment, maybe move laterally, escalate privileges. They might then deploy ransomware that's actually developed by a completely different group. So what you see when we look at actually today's ransomware operations, it's rarely one group conducting these operations. It's kind of might look like something that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. It's this highly decentralized approach, often many different groups and distinct entities collaborating on these groups, on these operations, often as part of a kind of what we call an affiliate model, where there might be one kind of group that's kind of running this and giving different entities a cut based on what they've done. So I think this is really interesting because I think when we talk about the professionalization of cybercrime, we're not actually talking about one group getting really big. We're talking about this ability to work in this decentralized ecosystem. But I think the other thing that is really significant for me is the fact that this has made ransomware far more specialized. Whereas in the past, maybe I had to conduct an entire ransomware operation myself, now I could just focus on gaining initial access or researching organizations to try and understand a bit more about them, so we could kind of conduct more targeted phishing links, or I could be just focused on moving around in the network. And that's made the cybercriminal ecosystem far more specialized. So we see, for instance, more cybercrime conducting supply chain compromise or targeting what we call zero-day vulnerabilities, i.e. vulnerabilities that don't have a patch available, where they're they're previously unknown about or not discovered. So that is, I think, because these parts of the cybercrime ecosystem can focus exclusively on researching supply chain compromise vectors or researching zero-day vulnerabilities. So with increased specialization has come increased sophistication as well. And then the last trend I wanted to cover, and I think it's something that is going to be really interesting to track, is the increased and the growing impact ransomware is having on operational technology. So what we see is, say, 1 in 7 times where data is leaked, and it's a critical infrastructure organization, that will include some very kind of sensitive operational technology as well. So I don't want to kind of overemphasize the threat this poses. I think actually a lot of the time when operational technology is targeted, it's probably through accidental targeting. It's just a ransomware group trying to encrypt anything and everything, if you like, and that might also include operational technology when those systems aren't properly segmented. But I do think it kind of poses an interesting strategic challenge, especially if ransomware groups decide to kind of really ramp this up. But right now, I think it's going to be an important one to track, especially given that the capability is there and the ways in which these groups conducting ransomware they're increasingly able to understand how to target operational technology systems, and clearly there's a very clear overlap there with national security. So with that, I just want to finish on some data points for you, and perhaps a bit of good news. Every year we look at a stat called dwell time, and that is the length of time between a threat actor gaining access to a network and being detected. And what we see in our region is that we're making real progress. If we go back to 2016, on average, threat groups were able to stay in a network for over 100 days. Last year, they were on average staying in a network 48 days before they were detected. And this year it's down to 20. So we're making some really strong and positive progress. And I think that highlights that with all of this insight into the threats, the sort of things I've discussed today, there's huge opportunity to actually use that to improve our ability to detect relevant threats, whether that's threats that are targeting Sweden or the Nordics, or whether that's threats targeting academia, for instance. Another interesting thing, if we break down this data further, one thing that really stuck out to me is the length of time, the dwell time, that stat I mentioned for ransomware. Last year, that was just 4 days. That's gone up to 33 days. So that might be actually the way that the ransomware groups are now conducting operations through more vulnerability exploitation. That's probably extending the dwell time. There's more of those distribution clusters, those different groups that are conducting these operations and working together. And that might mean that there's additional time as access is passed on, partly because ransomware groups are also trying to disable monitoring technology. But we should remember, even if ransomware is more sophisticated than it was a few years ago, with that increased dwell time comes huge opportunity. Because if these groups are in our environment, then that provides us opportunity to actually detect them before they're able to deploy ransomware. So critically, I just want to go back to that point I made at the very beginning, that when we talk about the threats, we're not doing this to scare people, right? What we're doing is we're talking about the threats to actually improve security outcomes. If we can understand these threats, then we should be empowered to really tackle these challenges head on by using all of that insight against these threat groups to really understand how they're working and how we can beat them. So with that, I really appreciate you listening. So I think there might be time for a few questions.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Thank you for this really interesting presentation. Are there any questions from the audience? Please raise your hand so you can get a microphone. Otherwise, while we're waiting, I have a question. What do you think in broad terms is sort of the ratio of importance between technology and human effort? How much is automation and finding the latest type of exploits versus creating misinformation, writing phishing emails, etc.?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think it kind of also depends on if we're talking about the defense or the offense, right? I think on the offensive side, there's still a lot of human effort. And I think if we look at the way that might be automated in the future, yes, there is some automated process, but I think for those sophisticated operators, especially the espionage groups, they're going to need that really strong tradecraft, and that's going to require humans for a very long time, in my opinion. I think on the defensive side, huge opportunities. We're still going to need skilled people, right? We're still going to need people entering this space. I think there's going to be a lot of job security in cybersecurity for the foreseeable future. But there has been a skill shortage, right? And there's a lot of burnout as a result. We're needing people to do more with less. So they're actually having automation. That's going to be really significant. And then I think interesting opportunities with AI there. If you look at AI, is not just about automating cybersecurity processes on the defensive side, but maybe also lowering the bar. So maybe we can actually make it so that people with limited experience of cybersecurity can still play an important role. Maybe for instance, one thing we're doing at Google is, rather than having to be really skilled in writing very technical detection rules, we could just say in plain speak, write a detection rule to find X, Y, Z, and then that can be converted into something that has that kind of more technical language that can play well with detection efforts. So I think a mix of both.
Thanks. And one more quick question. Otherwise, if there's nothing from the audience there, like what types of organizations work on the offensive sides? Is it like privateers, cyber criminals that in peacetime attack systems for monetary gain, and then they're hired by governments in war times to attack other governments? Or is it more like a standing army? Are they now hired by government ministries and work somewhere in a ministry basement permanently?
I mean, a fascinating question. I think the honest answer is that there's a real range, right? So we've seen with Russia, Ukraine, that we've seen Russian cyber criminal groups that we previously not really associated with these more politically motivated operations come to the fore at a time of conflict. But we also see a lot of more established contractors that are doing this on a more continuous basis. And even there, a real range of different operations and different types of organizations. That there might be some very legitimate reasons that contractors and private sector would sell to states. Maybe there'd be some legitimate law enforcement or counterterrorism tools that a government might buy from contractors. But of course, we also see these tools used in very irresponsible ways. So with that space, there are a range of different ethical views and stances held by private sectors, universities, contractors, individuals, cyber criminals. It's a bit of a wild west, to be perfectly honest.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's give Jamie our thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.